بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ومولانا محمد رسول الله وآله وصحبه ومن والاه وبعد. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. I should perhaps start off with some disclaimers. Asking one such as myself to speak on the topic of economics per se, would not be much different from asking a dentist to speak about brain surgery. It's a very specialized field. So I cannot, by any stretch of imagination, say that I'm an expert in economics. The discussion therefore will not be a descriptive discussion around economics, what economics is, how it works and so on, but rather the overlap between Islam as we know it, from its sources, from the various disciplines that have developed within the broad spectrum of Islamic knowledge and the economic field, because there is an overlap. It's that particular overlap which we will seek to exploit and discuss around. Economic theory per se, what should be, what shouldn't be, what is correct to be, what isn't correct to be. To those particular issues we will only be able to address ourselves to the extent that our Sharia, our Qur'an, the Hadith, the fiqh that we have inherited from our predecessors address themselves to those particular issues. The main issues within economics that are from a Sharia perspective neither here nor there. And then there are some issues that are clear cut. Accordingly, I will be speaking about this particular topic, Qur'an and economics, in about 6 or 7 different points. Initially, just as a matter of the emergence of the discipline, the history of economics as a discipline, because there was a time in human history when economics did not exist as an independent discipline, when it was rather part of something else, part of the fabric of another subject, that eventually individuated itself into various different components, individual disciplines and such. So how did it come into existence? Why did it come into existence as well? And it eventually came into existence in Muslims in the course of history between the heirs of all of human knowledge that they could lay hands on. Or they inherited from the Greeks, or they inherited from the Persians, or they inherited from Indian scholarship, and wherever else. When they took all of those legacies of knowledge and reworked it into something of their own, then something came about. Then there was some type of economic discussion within the broader spectrum of the Islamic legacy. How did that come about? Who was responsible for it? But even then too, we do not see an independent discipline of economics emerging. Thereafter, after we touch upon the history of economics and its emergence, we look thereafter at the Qur'an and economics. Specifically, does the Qur'an address itself to economic concepts and precepts? Now, the sciences which emerge out of the Qur'an, let's take one or two of them. One of them would be law, fiqh, substantive law. The Qur'an will certainly addresses itself to issues of marriage and divorce, buying and selling, interaction between nations, penal law, but not in a form that is recognizable as a legal code. That had to be unearthed out of the Qur'an by the legal scholars of the past and written up into the form of a law code as we know it today, which is the various madahib, with the sub-disciplines that happen to exist within there. That did not happen to economics until very late. It did not happen to economics until very late, but it did exist in some form or the other. In the same way as legal concepts existed in embryonic form within the Qur'an, within the Sunnah, economic concepts existed within there as well. So we'll touch upon about a dozen of those particular concepts where the Qur'an addresses itself to those particular concepts and what it says about them too. Thereafter, very briefly we'll touch upon why should one look at economics. There must have been some reason why some organizer of this conference decided that Qur'an and economics must be a topic. Why is it something that fascinates the modern mind? Why is it something that creates a sense of inquisitiveness? Why do we want to know about it? And then after having covered the why about it all, start looking at the how. How does one then go about structuring, extracting an Islamic economic theory out of the legacy that we have? Because we know up to now that it existed in embryonic form. Taking that embryo in the form of Quranic text, in the form of text from the Hadith, in the form of cases of consensus of the Ummah, and the manner in which it plays itself out in the fiqh of the fuqaha. Taking all of that and creating a new discipline called economics, how do we go about doing that? Thereafter, I want to look at one of the most important effects, consequences of economics, of economic development, the history of economics, and how it had a certain impact, not just upon the area in which it developed, which was Western Europe, but upon the rest of the world. The rest of the world in the form of what? When economics led to industrialization, led to colonialism, and colonialism affected the rest of the world. And then, from about the middle of the previous century, there came about a recovery from that particular impact. The impact of Western imperialism, colonization, colonialism upon the Muslim world and the rest of the third world, so-called third world. There came about a certain recovery. And that will be the spectrum of what we look at. Something about the history of economics, the question as to, or rather, where the Qur'an stands on it, the question as to why economics, how to structure it, how an Islamic economic theory will be structured. Then the impact that economics had upon the world, and the most important aspect of that, the most important vehicle of the impact that it had, which was corporatization. Thereafter, the recovery, which is the period that we find ourselves in right at this moment in time. So, with that as the background and the framework of discussion, let us proceed. Economics, the word as it stands over there is, of course, from two Greek terms, ecos and nomos. I think the speaker before me was speaking of ecology and the environment. That word ecos features there as well. But there the ecos speaks about the entire environment. And in the Greek language, as scholars would have it, that word could mean the home as well as the broader environment. Originally, when the Greeks started discussing economics, they were looking at it as a matter of what the Arabs later translated it into tadbirul manzil, management of the home. It was home management. And in this sense, every housewife, every earner is part of a small little economic microcosm. There's a certain amount of income and a certain amount of expenditure, and maintaining balance between those two is exactly what amounts to tadbirul manzil, managing the home. And the same principles that would apply in managing the balance between supply and demand at this level will replicate itself at the higher macro level as well. So essentially, there has been the tendency to define economics as the discipline that looks at studies the relationship between supply and demand. It's not necessarily, it doesn't come down to the level of how to structure a contract. That much is contract law. And I make specific reference to that because often I have found that Muslims tend to confuse the two terms when they look at a theory of Islamic economics. Islamic economics is a different thing, Islamic finance is a different thing. There is an overlap between the two. Islamic finance being a component in a larger economic structure, but economics is a discipline that simply looks at the broader principles, the manner in which to negotiate and balance that particular supply and demand kind of mechanism. Yes, Islam does address itself to it. It addresses itself to it in the form of sometimes making broad statements that assume the form of principle and policy, and sometimes at the level of regulating the conduct of a Muslim interacting with his fellow Muslim in terms of buying and selling and leasing and hiring and employing. All of those are economic activities, but they are not economics. Only when they aggregate, when about 1 million of those contracts, or 5 million of them, aggregate themselves into a certain economic activity in society, do we find that economics has something to say about it. But when the person is engaged in a particular contract with someone else, it's a matter of law, not yet economics. So economics as a field would tend to overlap with law, tends to overlap with politics. It very much overlaps with history as well. Very much overlaps with history. It actually draws from all of these various fields. The Greeks conceived of it in that particular manner. Since economics, as we said, has a certain historical aspect to it as well. There is an historical aspect to it. Therefore, the first one in Muslim society, Muslim history, credited with having identified certain economic trends within Islam, within history in general, is Ibn Khaldun. Ibn Khaldun wrote history in a manner that is a bit different from everyone else. Everyone else would simply say, in year so-and-so this happened, in year so-and-so that happened. That part of the world was conquered and that person died. A pure factual recollection of events. Ibn Khaldun said, he'll write history but in a different manner. You look at trends in history. And when you start looking at trends in history, then you start seeing certain tendencies develop, and then you start seeing how money theory has an impact upon the entire course that the history of a particular nation takes. When Ibn Khaldun, for example, says that تجارة الدولة مضرة بالرعاية, He says, when the state becomes a trader, that causes harm to your population. The state should not be a trader. The state should be the regulator of trade. But when the state enters the market as a trader, then simply by its size, by its sheer size, it outweighs everyone else. And by its power, it can make certain laws that advantage itself to the disadvantage of the population, and as such it becomes mudirratun bil-ra'aya. It causes a certain negative impact upon the rest of the population. It causes an imbalance within the free market economy. So he's made a certain remark, but where has he drawn it from? He hasn't drawn it directly from Qur'an as such. He has drawn it from observation. Now, ever since the science has developed along the line, or along empirical lines, where people would investigate things not purely in matter of what does revelation say about it, but also what does observation history say about it. Ever since that started happening, economics developed away from religion, completely away from religion. Study trends and you will come to certain conclusions. And therefore Marx would be able to say that all of human history is simply a matter of what? Class struggle, the one against the other. In any society, when it's slave against master, in whichever manner it happens, it's a matter of class struggle, one against the other. It's an observation of history. He addresses himself to history. Similarly, Ibn Khaldun looked at history and he drew certain economic conclusions from there. Several centuries later, about 3-4 centuries ago, 3 centuries ago, so Shah Waliullah within the Indian subcontinent, in writing his magnum opus, Hujjatullah al-Baligha, includes in there a chapter copying in that particular way, drawing from the experience of the philosophers, both the non-Muslim philosophers and the Islamic philosophers as well, who, in terms of the layout of their structure, would take it from Greek antecedents. They would take it from Greek origins. So, Tadbirul Manzil, or which is a literal translation of economics, features within his book as well. There is something, because Shah Waliullah is here making broad remarks about how society works, how society develops, and how society changes. And one inescapable and unavoidable phenomenon of society is the manner in which people buy and sell and engage in commercial activity. So he includes that. He includes that Tadbirul Manzil as a study, but up to this moment in time, economics hasn't developed as a separate discipline as yet. This would wait for a while, because by and large, the Muslim world, for 1,000 years and more of its history, it was an agrarian society. It was a simple economy in which a farmer produces goods, brings it to the market, sells it on the market, where it is bought by, what shall we call them, whoever the purchase happens to be, it's taken home, it is turned into other substances which people eventually eat. It was a very simple, very primitive, very agrarian society. So within an agrarian society like that, a high-level historian could at times make certain remarks, but no one actually set out developing a theory of how things should be. No one had by that time developed a theory that imposes itself upon politics and upon religion and upon ethics and morals and just about every aspect of society. That would wait for the impact of industrialization, colonization. Within Western Europe, when economics started developing side by side with industrialization, the normal course of commercial development would be so slow, it would be so slow in an agrarian society that you take note of that particular development only perhaps after 50 to 100 years after it has happened. It's at a snail's pace. But industrialization meant rapid development of society. So rapidly that you can actually see the trends taking shape in front of your eyes. And therefore, they started the tendency of certain writers devoting themselves to economic theory. So you find what? Adam Smith will write The Wealth of Nations, not very long after him, some 60 years or so after him. Karl Marx would write Das Kapital. And each one has a certain theory. On the one hand, we have now unbridled capitalism. On the other hand, we have unbridled communism, Marxism, Leninism on the other side. And economic theory would have remained secluded and restricted to the hallowed halls of the universities. However, Marx initially and Lenin thereafter had other ideas. It wasn't intended simply to remain theory. 1917, the Russian Revolution brought it into practical application. And the results that came from there afterwards divided the world during the Cold War era and in the post-Second World era into two blocks. Two economic blocks, but economic at the same time political, at the same time ideological. So it has a certain impact upon society. And this takes us to the next question as to why economics should be of importance. Why is it that we have an interest in it and it creates that type of inquisitiveness within our minds? Simply because in our particular conception of our religion, the way we see Islam, the teaching of Moses, it's a way of life. What it boils down to is that it covers every aspect of our lives. And anything that would in any way impact or impinge upon the direction of the course that our lives take is of importance to us. So if economic theory was to Ibn Khaldun merely a remark of history, if it was to Shah Waliullah just a remark of sociology, it has now become something else. It is something that actually plots the course as to where society is headed for in terms of its law, in terms of its politics, in terms of its morals, ethics, and very much in terms of its religion. Because 1917 and the Russian Revolution and what happened thereafter shows us to what extent ideologues will go to enforce their ideology upon others. The conquest of Central Asia, the Central Asian nations, by the Russians in Tsar's times was then succeeded to by the communists. And thereafter the repression for 70, 80 years of those particular nations, those nations of Central Asia. And wherever else communism took root, the manner in which it forced several generations of Muslims, forced a wedge between them and their religion. The manner in which China to the very present day is continuing to drive that kind of wedge between its Muslim population and their religion, it tells us that this is of a certain importance. It is not something which is simply to be taken note of and discarded. I mention this to those who happen to be studying economics. It probably goes without saying that it's an important discipline. But to those, and I'm referring especially to those studying Islamic studies within what kind of environments? Within our traditional environments. The traditional environment of the madrasa, the Darul Ulum, the Jamia Islamiyya, of the Islamic University. There, this particular discipline tends to be looked on with a bit of suspicion. With a bit of suspicion born out of ignorance. What is it really all about? Do we need to study? It was never studied in the past. Does it have any impact? So it is a discipline, it exists and it has an impact upon society. Therefore it must be looked at to some extent or the other. If for no other reason, then simply for reason of the fact that it impacts upon society, it impacts upon individuals, it impacts upon the very thing that we regard as the purpose for which we were created. For the ibadah of Allah, that's why we were created. So something that interferes with that purpose must of necessity be of importance to us. How does one go about instructing an Islamic economic theory? It wasn't there once upon a time. There are snippets of information to be found here, there, and all over the show. So when scholars eventually started applying themselves to the task of restructuring in Islamic economic theory, obviously they had the same idea as the ones had who set this particular program and gave me a topic to speak about the Qur'an and economics. We believe the Qur'an to be the fountainhead of everything. We believe that the Qur'an is Tibyanan li kulli shay, an explanation for all things. Therefore, if anything is going to contain the embryonic roots of our Islamic economic theory, we'll have to visit the Qur'an. But let's not make the mistake of reductionism to the extent that it's only the Qur'an and nothing else. The Qur'an will contain the most important indicators of what should be. But the Qur'an has never been seen in isolation of the other sources of the law. Because at this moment we might not have every aspect of economic theory covered in the Qur'an. We have various different indications, we have various different manifestations of something that would assume to have economic proportions. But the Qur'an is complemented by other sources of our law as well. And that would be number one, the Sunnah, then the consensus of the Ummah, and then to some extent or the other, there would be the jurisprudence of the fuqaha, of our legal scholars over the years. There are certain major issues within economics. We speak, for example, about something like private ownership. Does Islam subscribe to the theory of private ownership? Can individuals own? Or is there no such a thing as individuals owning? Does the state own everything? That's a macro issue. It's not a micro issue that will be addressed in the Qur'an. But if you come down to something less than that, to what extent is the state allowed to interfere with the free market economy? You're not going to find a clear indication of that in the Qur'an. Oblique references might be here and there, but you're not going to find absolutely clear, unambiguous reference to that in the Qur'an. You go to the Hadith, you will find some of it. You go thereafter, if you refine the issues even further beyond it, then you will find in the ijtihadat of the fuqaha, in the legal exertions of our legal scholars of the past, you will find them having addressed some of these issues. For example, resources such as gold and silver, oil and things like this, are they to be nationalized or can they be privately owned? No clear directive whatsoever, no clear directive within the Qur'an. And nothing that clear within the Hadith either, because back then you rarely found cases where people actually found huge amounts of naturally created treasure on the earth. Here and there someone will stumble over something, discover some hidden treasure, and that will just be about it. And for that, we have something in fiqh which addresses it. Zakat must be given. We just go to the extent of saying you can have ownership of it, but give the zakat of it. But finding natural resources, to the extent that we find it millions, if not billions of cubic meters of it, and the entire Witwatersrand full of gold, and the entire Oaktown Kimberley area full of diamonds, is that supposed to be appropriated by individuals? Can someone like a Moulana Tauha or someone like a I forget their names even for that matter, but can someone come and appropriate that to himself in some way or the other? That we have a De Beers or Anglo-American becoming the oligarch that exercise the hegemony over everyone else. You won't find clear directory of it, very clear directory, but certain general indications, and then some in the ijtihadat of the fuqaha, some indications that can be useful in this particular regard. So it is a tricky business. It is a tricky business, not very, very clear cut, and on some issues the jury will still be out. Some issues will still be debated. One example of things that could be debated. Fiat currency. Fiat currency is debated at the moment purely theoretically. Only theoretically, because in actual fact, the currencies which we are using and which just about everyone else happens to be using, happens to be fiat currency. Fiat currency means it is currency because government says so. Fiat as the word means what? Let it be. So purely on governmental decree, it becomes money. One theory would say bimetallic currency has to be removed. You can only have gold and silver, nothing else. Because if not gold and silver, then you will find this kind of problems in society of inflation and everything else. And a number of other social and economic problems associated with it. And another opinion is saying, no, fiat currency is not necessarily bad, is not necessarily evil, is not necessarily against the grain of Islamic society. The jury is still very much out on that one. So certain issues will be very clear, certain issues will be less clear than that. We ask, however, the question, let us take a look at the specific instances within the Qur'an, and then to a lesser degree within the Hadith, and thereafter within the fiqh, in which look at some of those instances. Now I have listed about 10, 12 of them. The first one will probably be the one that we started off from. Does the Qur'an recognize the idea of property? Does it recognize who owns the property is something else? Who owns the property is the second point. Does it recognize that humans can own property? I think that probably goes without saying. Because we have so many different instances in which the Qur'an speaks about the idea of mal, what you own, what others own. Do not transgress it against that which others own. لا تأكلوا أموالكم بينكم بالباطل. Do not eat the wealth mutually amongst yourself in a wrongful manner. It presupposes that the Qur'an is already espousing the idea of ownership, of wealth. So property does exist. There's probably going to be no dispute around that. The second issue, however, does the Qur'an espouse the idea of private ownership? Can individuals own? Again, the indications, the textual indications of the Qur'an are absolutely clear. Allah Ta'ala regards it as what? Your wealth. It's your individual wealth. The Qur'an at no moment adumbrates a theory of state ownership of property. The type of thing that Marx went to and Lenin took up afterwards. That kind of idea doesn't exist. In South Yemen, in Hadramaut, which was probably the only Arab and Muslim country that ever went for fully fledged communism. And like all the other communist states, it eventually succumbed. But in Hadramaut for a while, when the communists asserted themselves, and they started with their economic reforms and so on, they had actually attempted to rewrite the theory of private ownership and trying to say that the state has the right to interfere. Now that is one of the topics that we will come to after, as to what extent can the state interfere. But obviously what they tried to do was to maximize it, that the state has the right to maximize as far as possible. And I think any communistic society, any socialistic society will have to at least give some degree of private ownership. Now, the extent to which you do it on a continuum from 0 to 100%, you're not going to get 100% divesting private owners of ownership. To what extent are you going to give it? That particular market can shift on that continuum to any degree. You can have more of it or less of it. As far as the Qur'an is concerned, individuals do own property. When they die, they have heirs who inherit it from them. There is no such a thing as state property. However, having said that, the Qur'an doesn't leave it unbridled. There is the idea of ownership, but your ownership is not unbridled. The ownership is always regarded as not unbridled ownership, but stewardship. You own, but however, it's a matter of وَآتُوهُمْ مِمَّا لِلَّهِ الَّذِي آتَاكُمْ. Give unto them of Allah's wealth, which He has given to you. So in ownership, there are two levels of ownership that is always recognized. There's the level of ultimate divine ownership, which is what? لِلَّهِ مَا فِي السَّمَاوَاتِ وَمَا فِي الْأَرْضِ. Everything in heaven and earth belongs to Allah. There is tamlik, there is the idea of ownership. But then at a lower level, you as the human owner, you are regarded as having some type of ownership. There's one instance in which we see human ownership completely receding and only divine ownership remaining, and the human remaining purely just as a manager. That is the institution of waqf. When I have a certain property and I want to make it waqf, it means basically that I remove any form of human ownership and I vest that, or rather, I leave it in what it has always been vested all along, which is divine ownership. Belongs to Allah and Allah alone. No human ownership whatsoever. But there needs to be human management of it. So in that instance, we see the receding of human ownership and the imposition, or rather the reassertion of divine ownership together with human stewardship. So Allah Ta'ala regards it, or the Qur'an sees ownership as always a form of stewardship. You have wealth, you have the right to dispose of it, but there are limits within which you can dispose of it, within which you can deal with it. And this is where contract law in Islam comes in and sets those particular limits. Now here, there are some things in the Qur'an which are left, which appear in embryonic form and are left in the Quran in embryonic form, and then the Sunnah comes along to detail the matter. For example, Salah, something you should do on a daily basis. But Salah, when it is done, or rather when it's discussed in the Quran, it's a matter of aqimus Salah. No further details. Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam comes and gives a detail of it. Hajj, lillahi ala nasi hijjul bayt. So Allah has placed an obligation upon you to make the Hajj. But Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam explains it, and the Quran will not contain complete details. However, commercial matters, matters of trade and industry and commerce, Allah Ta'ala has taken those and given a great amount of detail to it. And we just need to look at two particular instances. One is succession to property. The Quran normally doesn't go down to nitty-gritty. When it comes to succession of property, it goes down to quarters and sixths and halves and identification of specific Quranic heirs. So-and-so gets this much, but if there's a child, then it gets half to this amount, so-and-so gets this much. The Quran, it is like out of the norm for the Quran to go to that amount of detail. But it does that on account of the importance that it attaches to that. The longest ayah in the Quran, and one of the last to be revealed then is يَا أَيُّهَا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا إِذَا تَدَايَنْتُمْ بِدَيْنٍ إِلَىٰ أَجَلٍ مُسَمًّى. Credit transactions. If you engage into a credit transaction, then you have 1.5, even almost 2 pages of details. The longest ayah in the Quran addresses itself to this particular aspect here. So it is very important. But it's important at the level of the contract law, how individuals will deal with specific kinds of property. But those are the limitations which sets out now the parameters of stewardship. The Quran also addresses itself, obviously, as we've seen now before, trade. Since the Quran discusses trade, it sets limits to trade, it says how you should trade. Trade is probably the most important component of an economy. There has to be trade. At the bottom of it all is trade, and the Quran recognizes that trade does happen, and the verses to it are more numerous than we can throw a stick at this moment. Having said that, once there is trade in the society, then it expects certain things at large. It expects certain things of the individual, structured in a particular manner. However, by and large, there is one condition that attaches to any kind of trade. There must be justice and there must be fairness about it all. How does the Quran address that particular thing? 2 instances I will make reference to here. One is the ayah that I read just a while ago. لَا تَأْكُلُوا أَمْوَالَكُمْ بَيْنَكُمْ بِالْبَاطِلِ. Do not consume the property of one another in a wrongful manner. And he goes on to say, but you can do that, you can engage in trade, إِلَّا أَن تَكُونَ تِجَارَةً. Except if it happens to be a matter of trade, where you buy and sell, or you barter, عَنْ تَرَاضٍ مِّنْكُمْ. But it has to be by your consent. No party can be forced into a particular deal. It must be by his consent. The Quran identifies various different forms of deviation in human history. With our ummah, at the time that the Quran was revealed, the deviation had not yet set in. Because the ummah was still at its birth stage. It was still in the form of a baby. It hasn't even started growing. But then Allah wants to indicate to us how things can go wrong commercially, economically. It hasn't happened to this ummah yet. But it's brought to our attention in the stories of previous nations. And in here, in this particular regard, we find that Allah Ta'ala speaks about the history of various Anbiya and their communities before. And each one contains a specific form of social deviation, social corruption. The people of Madian and Shu'aib alayhi salam, specifically in this regard, give us an example of the departure and the absence of fairness and equity within trade. لا تنقصوا المكيال والميزان. Do not give less than full measure. أوفوا الكيل والميزان ولا تبخسوا الناس أشياء ولا تعثوا في الأرض مفسدين. Do not give less than full measure. Do not deny people their rightful that which rightfully belongs to them. Do not deny it unto them, and do not create mischief in the earth. I think at no time in society has it ever happened that business, that commerce has created as much fasad fil ard as in the time that we are living in right now. The times in which we are living in is the one, as we will hopefully, if time will allow, we take some type of look at what big business has done to the world on account of the absence of some of these factors. But justice and fairness is definitely there. The Qur'an addresses itself to it. The Qur'an does not give any clear indication as to what. The Qur'an doesn't give any clear indication as to a free market economy. No clear indication. Yes, private ownership is recognized. And the fact that there does not have to be equity in the amount in which each person owns. Some people are going to own more, and some are going to own less. Some will own it on account of having earned it by their blood and sweat, and some will only have inherited it from their forefathers. Allah acknowledges the fact that ownership of goods, ownership of wealth will be to various degrees. وَاللَّهُ فَضَّلَ بَعْضَكُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ فِي الرِّزْقِ. Allah Ta'ala has given preference to some over others in terms of risk. Risk has been handed out to some more, to some less. If some have more and some have less, then that still doesn't say much about how free is your market economy. But in Medina Munawwara, market economy started developing. Market economy started developing. And the Sahaba radiallahu anhu came to Nabi sallallahu alayhi wa sallam and asked him for something. He said, Sa'ir lana ya Rasulullah, Sa'ir lana. What we will call it today is probably mandatory pricing. We buy goods in the market, whether it's wheat, whether it's date, whether it's barley, whether it's milk, whatever it might be, set mandatory prices for us. Now that's government interfering with this very sensitive mechanism of a free market economy. Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam refused to do that. He said, دَعِ النَّاسَ يَرْزُقِ اللَّهُ بَعْضَهُم مِّن بَعْضٍ. Leave people, and Allah gives them risk from one another. What is he basically saying? I'm not interfering with the market. Let the market regulate itself. It is extremely sensitive mechanism within society, and interference within the market can lead to upheaval in so many other sectors. So as long as the market is operating optimally, as long as the market is regulating itself over and above the broad parameters which Allah Ta'ala has imposed upon it, then we are not going to interfere with that market. The scholars thereafter disagree to what extent, or rather at which particular point in the development of that market will government step in. The Shafi'i school in this regard will say at no point, even if the market goes haywire, even if the market deviates, don't step in. The Hanafi school, the Maliki school see a greater amount of authority for governments to intervene at such a stage. And when it comes to inflation, not just inflation, hyperinflation, the government is bound to step in and do something about it. This is an example of a matter in which the jury of the jurists is still out. It's a matter in which they have differed. So there we cannot say that Islam says free markets must never be interfered with, or Islam says free markets should be interfered with. No, we have two different approaches to it. So in the manner in which we'll structure that particular economic theory, sometimes we draw it from direct influences in Qur'an, sometimes we take direct guidance from the Sunnah, and sometimes the situations in which the scholars have differed with one another allow for more than one option to exist. And those are the issues that have not been decided. So we have a free market, but that will thereafter have to be a regulated market. A number of regulations impose themselves upon it. One of the most important ones would be what? No monopolization in society. Very important economic concept, because if a person has captured, has monopolized the market within one specific commodity or more, then what does it? It allows him leverage that is asymmetrical to the rest of society, and immediately you will see that what happens. He has an unwarranted type of impact upon that particular community and his economic life. So we don't believe monopolization is something which has been prohibited. And an indication to that is to be found in Surah Al-Hashr. where Allah speaks about the distribution of funds as they flow into the coffers of state. How should they be distributed thereafter? How should that funds be distributed? In mentioning that particular distribution, there's an enigmatic sentence in that ayah. It says, كَيْ لَا يَكُونَ دُولَةً بَيْنَ الْأَغْنِيَاءِ مِنْكُمْ, so that the distribution of that particular state wealth should not become something monopolized and restricted only certain circles within society. So yes, the Qur'an has something to say about that. Then over and above all of this, of course, there is the idea of mutual social responsibility. You own something, but you have responsibility towards society. And I think this is the one aspect that we are all very familiar with. Allah makes reference to it. You own, but you have an obligation. وَفِي أَمْوَالِهِمْ حَقٌّ لِلسَّائِلِ وَالْمَحْرُومِ. You own something, but as you own it, there's an obligation of wanting to help those that are less fortunate in society. So again, there's an imposition of something. This is where zakah comes in to play a certain role in stabilizing economic life. Exploitation. Spoken about monopolization, but exploitation, all of human history has never witnessed a mechanism as evil in terms of exploitation as the riba mechanism. The riba mechanism, and therefore the riba is probably regarded as well. You know, if the Qur'an addresses itself in great amount, in minute detail, to economic issues, then it addresses itself with a great amount of emphasis, more emphatic than anything else in condemning the sin of riba. No other sin is said to be warfare against Allah and His Rasul. But when it comes to riba, it is a matter of what? It is a matter of going to war against Allah and His Rasul. Zina doesn't carry that. Sariqah, stealing doesn't carry that. Murder doesn't carry that particular epithet. But riba does. And riba is the one that was most emphatically condemned in the Qur'an and the Sunnah and in the fiqh of the fuqaha, wherever we have to find it. One aspect, remaining aspect of what we find in the Qur'an is the one of corporatization. What happens in corporatization? Generally, this does not seem to be something as Quranic. It's something that just happens in society, and then the fuqaha address themselves to it, and they do something about it. But no. What has happened is that in Western Europe, like in any agrarian society, for a long time, circumstances were simply such that they do not lend themselves, they do not allow for the amassing of great amounts of capital within the hands of a few managers. I can go into a partnership with my friend or my brother or my cousin, and maybe get a few others, we'll be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. But having one corporate entity in which there are subscribers, in which there are contributors, a few hundred, if not a few 100,000, if not a few million of them, that allows for the aggregation of a great amount of capital within the hands of a few. And this has been the most important manner in which Western Europe, after its voyages of discovery, its age of discovery, and thereafter its industrialization, in which Western Europe has had this terrible impact upon the rest of the world, because they simply had too much capital in their hands, and small little corporate entities, small little partnerships were now turned into a psychopathic giant that could do whatever it wishes. It says something, definitely says something when we consider the fact that South Africa was not colonized by the Dutch government. It was colonized by the Dutch East India Company. All of India was not conquered by the British government. It was conquered by the British East India Company. And it remained that way from the 1700s up to 1857. Only after the supposed mutiny of 1857 did Queen Victoria become the Empress of India. Did the British government take hold of India. After that time, it was the equivalent of ShopRite taking over all of Malawi. Company taking over an entire country and running it as his personal fiefdom. That came about on account of corporatization. Corporatization, what are the roots of corporatization? Where did it come from? How did it come into existence? Corporatization, the corporate entity, limited liability, all of those things, it's something upon which the West is quite proud. One of the great achievements of the West, because it allowed them this great amount of sway over the rest of the world. You know, when did it happen? It happened geographically. One of the factors to be considered in the economy is also geographic location. Geographic location was such, Islam was fortuitously placed at the center of the world. Because trade used to be basically east-west. And what comes from the east travels through the Middle East to come to the west. We were the natural middlemen to the world. Natural middlemen, all trade has to pass through us, and therefore we maintain our economic position as well as our political position as a result. The moment the route around the Cape was found by Vasco da Gama, that's when the sun set for the east. The moment Vasco da Gama sailed around the Cape, this is why they called it the Cape of Good Hope, because it it meant their sun is rising, our sun is now setting. The moment they sailed around it, colonization, colonialism ensued as a result. And that's what created Western Europe and its hegemony with the rest of the world. It was very much an economic thing. Does the Qur'an say anything about this? Not directly. However, there's a story in Suasar of Sayyidina Dawood alayhi salam. Sayyidina Dawood alayhi salam is within his mihrab, his private place where he is making his ibadah. And suddenly he finds a number of people appearing in front of him. They have a question that they want to put to him. And he gives them a certain answer. The person says, I've got 99 sheep and my friend here has got 1 sheep and he wants me to give my sheep in as well. Without any going into the detail about what the story is all about, Dawood alayhi salam makes a remark here. وَإِنَّ كَثِيرًا مِنَ الْخُلَطَاءِ لَيَبْغِي بَعْضُهُمْ عَلَى بَعْضٍ وَإِنَّ كَثِيرًا مِنَ الْخُلَطَاءِ. Many people who have joint commercial interests, intersecting commercial interests. I've pulled my money with yours, with his, with hers, we got it all together. So we are khulata, we are partners together. Many a times you find, and this is one of the laws of economics as well, you find it that when you find such aggregation of great amount of capital, the stronger ones basically lead the others by the nose. It is supposed to be each one has a proportionate share of a say, of a voting what happens. But in great big companies, what happens? There came about this separation between ownership and control. Berlin Means in the 70s wrote about this, the separation between ownership on the one hand and control. Ownership, those who actually capitalize the company. They sit at home and wait for the dividends and they have no control of the company whatsoever. So companies became self-regulating entities that make laws for themselves. Managers who are employed by the company, basically taking the company in directions that they wish. And that's how we found colonialism and everything coming about. Dawood alayhi salam says, "Inna kathiran min al-khulata." Often when you have this, you find some of them, la yabghi ba'duhum ala ba'd. They transgress against one another. And this is what we find happening when the corporate entity grew too great. And this is the dilemma of the modern world in which we find ourselves. Corporate entities have become so great that they basically, it has become a matter of the tail wagging the dog. The dog of government is no longer wagging the tail of corporate society. But corporate society dictates to governments which way to go. Whether it's to go to war, whether it's to pass certain laws. You know, what triggered the 2008 crisis, financial crisis in the world was basically Wall Street dictating to the capital, dictating to the White House, how the laws and everything should be structured. And when those laws were relaxed, eventually they came about this particular crisis. Here in our country, at this moment in time, just before the crisis, we have the National Credit Act, the NCA came about. And the banks are straining against the leash because they are now restricted in terms of how much they can go and do, how much credit they can go and give. And they're straining against the leash, looking for every opportunity and loophole within the book to be able to do business as usual. Having forgotten what has happened elsewhere. Why? Because the profit incentive, the profit motive is simply too powerful. So it must be restrained. Corporate society must be restrained. One particular economist in this regard, his work comes to mind, Jeffrey Sachs has written a book about specifically this problem. And he says that what he basically comes down to is that corporatization and all these laws and everything that we have won't come to anything. It will just come back to the same cycle of exploitation over and boom and bust and crashes every now and then. And it won't build society up. It's going to break society down all the time. Because it's only for the profit motive. It's purely for the profit motive. And therefore, Dawood alayhi salam's statement, which the Qur'an recalls, doesn't stop simply by saying that people transgress against one another. It gives us also an answer, a solution to the problem. And the solution to the problem is, إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ إِنَّ كَثِيرًا مِنَ الْخُلَطَاءِ لَا يَبْغِي بَعْضُهُم عَلَى بَعْضٍ. They transgress against one another. إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ. If there is iman, if a person understands his place in society, if he understands exactly where he fits in, if he understands his origins and his destiny where he's headed for, then you won't actually take it away. So when that kind of moral directive is no longer there, then we find unbridled corporatism to the extent that the world has seen, to the extent that the amount of lives that have been lost, the amount of countries that have been bankrupted and so on. And then the Quran goes on to say, وَقَلِيلٌ مَا. And very few are those who will conduct themselves economically, but in a manner of iman and amal salih, and in a sense of responsibility to Allah, responsibility in the akhirah, responsibility to society at large. So that's how the Quran would look at all of these particular things here. So the corporate mechanism, how did it come about? This particular corporate mechanism that has become this unsightly giant that has done this kind of terrible things within human society. How did it come about? What basically happens? The corporate entity was born from where Western Europe has a tendency, anything of value that they have, and this particular corporate entity was something of great value. Anything of value that they have a tendency, oh, we got this from the Greeks, we got it from the Romans, it's our own. In this particular regard as well, some of them insisted that it comes from the Greeks and the Romans. Comes from the Greeks and comes from the Romans. When they went to investigate it, there's nothing with the Greeks and nothing with the Romans. The Romans have a very elaborate law, but they have no idea of a corporate entity except a juristic personality as such. Then they went to go look in Jewish law. They went to go look at a number of other avenues. They couldn't find it. Abraham Yudovich was a researcher and a professor at Princeton or Harvard University, one of those. And he wrote a paper eventually in which he says that the closest antecedent and the most likely route that the corporate entity juristic personality has is the mudaraba of the Muslims. And what's the mudaraba of the Muslims all about? One party contributes wealth, another party contributes labor, and the sharing of wealth and labor leads to the sharing of profits, if there is a profit. And if there is no profit, then the sharing of loss as well. Not just Western Europe, but all the rest of human society has only ever known one method. Only ever known one method. And it's the exploitative method of riba. You go back to 5,000 years ago, the Chinese were doing it. The Greeks were doing it. The Greeks were doing it. The Romans were doing it. And every society has done it, and eventually they came about thinkers who represent a conscience, and they condemn it, and for a while they stay away from it, and then they succumb to it again. So every society that has had the condemnation of riba has also seen succumbing to the riba motive. There is one society, they say, only one society has said that riba is condemned. We will condemn it, but we will look for an alternative. Condemnation without looking for an alternative is worthless. Just saying it is haram doesn't take us anywhere. We have to produce solutions. We have to produce solutions, and that is why, together with the condemnation of the riba, this particular riba mechanism, we come to an idea such as mudaraba. Mudaraba has not simply been a small little contractual structure. Scholars have written, economists have written, that the effects of mudaraba in the golden age of the Islamic Empire could be found deep into Central Asia and China on the one hand, and into Scandinavia. But Islam had to be reached, but the manner in which Muslims did business told the entire world a manner of doing business that is equitable and just. However, then modern Europe arose once again, and the riba mechanism became the most important thing. Eventually there came the First World War, the Second World War, Europe was brought to its knees, and then we're living in a post-Bellum society now, after the Second World War. And Western Europe is in a great crisis. Western Europe's crisis basically, it came about as a crisis of the war, after having seen such a lot of destruction, after having seen such a lot of loss of life and limb and property. People started asking themselves some very deep existential questions. Muslims were asking themselves questions as well, but it wasn't to do with the war, because Muslims were not party to this, the Second World War. In the First World War, to a very minimal extent, to the extent that Ottoman Turkey participated on the side of Germany. Aside from that, nothing else. And aside from the fact that it led to the abolition of the Khilafah eventually. But Muslims weren't part of the war effort. They were very much part of the fallout after the war effort, when colonialists eventually started rolling out the colonial society, the colonial empires. When they started rolling it out, then Muslims now started asking themselves questions. We ruled the world for 1,000 years and more, and then we were completely dominated by a different society. Now we need to find our own identity once again. We have an economy, we have a law, we have a Sharia, we have a Qur'an, we have a Hadith, we have a Sunnah that definitely gives us guidance into this regard. So let's go into it, let's unearth it. And let's start practicing it. The response, that's the recovery. After colonialism, the post-colonial recovery has a number of phenomena that are associated with it. First of all, the emergence of Islamic nation states. There was a while, under the Khilafah Rashida, we had just one great Khilafah empire. And then they started gradually disintegrating various different regional empires, regional kingdoms, until eventually with the unbundling of the Ottoman Empire, Western Europe then created out of it a number of sovereign nation states. The old land of Syria, of Sham, suddenly found itself divided into 4 territories: Syria and Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine, and all the other various nation states that emerged. So suddenly we found a number of Muslim states coming together and saying that, okay, let's form ourselves into an organization of what they call an Islamic conference. We have some kind of organization, shall we do together on one economic bloc. Ideas that were on the table once upon a time. After about 50 years of that, we can see that not enough has come from that. There hasn't been enough cooperation between Muslim states to bring them into an independent bloc that operates on its own. But there has been something else. The other phenomenon that appeared together with this was the phenomenon of Islamic finance. And that, I said, is the one that's normally confused with Islamic economics as such. It forms a certain aspect of it. Islamic finance is what applies to each individual. Not to nation states as nation states, not to large societies as society, but to societies in the sense that society is made up of individuals, because it applies to every individual. In every manner that each contract is structured, it must conform to Sharia. It's one of those particular aspects that has been forgotten, put on the back burner as far as many Muslims are concerned, and the religion has become a matter of devotional observance and a bit of family law here and there. Those particular ahkam of muamalat, of financial dealings have been forgotten, relegated to some other part. One or two of those remain loom large in the imagination of Muslims. Everyone still knows that riba is haram. And everyone for some reason or the other imagines, don't know, but imagine that Islam says you cannot sell anything for more than 100% profit. That's an imagined kind of concept. It doesn't exist. But in the absence, in the vacuum, where there is no clear directive as to what does Islam really say in terms of our muamalat, people will start imagining, making up things. So you find this kind of misconceptions floating about. That particular topic of Islamic finance, however, and looking at how Muslims can be economically active within society today and from here going forward, is a topic completely on its own that would require probably a few hours of discussion around that specifically. The topic that was given to me was Islam and economics, and I conceived of it in the manner as I have presented to you here now. I come to Islamic finance at the end on account of the fact that that is what affects you and me as persons individually. What happens at the level of society at large, at the macro level, will be things that decisions that will be made at a different level. Or unless all of us start economically acting in a particular manner so that it can all aggregate into one huge mass action, social action that will have some kind of economic impact. But even in the absence of that, even in the absence of an aggregated social action, of mass action that has that particular social impact, we still remain under obligation to transact in the manner that Islam demands and requires. It's like making salah. Salah is intended to put you in direct communion with your Creator. You're supposed to come out of salah feeling spiritually invigorated once again. But we know the fact of the matter is that often we go into it, we come out of it not having gone 1 inch up, perhaps having gone down a few notches at times. The fact that salah is not so spiritually invigorating doesn't mean we should stop doing it. It should still be continued. The enterprise of Islamic finance remains an exciting one. It remains a controversial one. Scholars will differ. In fact, there's one broad difference, area of difference or locus of difference. There are some of the scholars that are involved in the field that are economists. And economists all try to see things in macro terms. So they want to see macro change here, right now. And on the other hand, the meaningless kind of approach. Let's engineer existing contracts a little bit here and a little bit there and make it available to the public, perhaps with the hope that one step today, another tomorrow. One swallow doesn't make a summer, but perhaps a whole flock of them, when they aggregate into a whole flock, will be able to create those kind of outcomes if the time should ever arise. And I think I've exhausted my time, so I think we'll call it quotes after here, and I think there's some open floor. Yes. Okay, sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad wa alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah, alladhi ni'matihi lana salih.
Well, Allahu Akbar. You have two types of ships. You have economic ships, and then you have Moulana Tauha Karaan, mindset ships. So, shukran for that. Jazakallah. It was really an informative and intellectually charged session. We'll now open up the floor to Q&A. We have approximately 20 minutes, so we can take like 5, 6, 7 questions. Wasim, bismillah.
Shukran for your presentation. I found it very informative. I have two questions. The first is with regard to nationalization of land resources. It's a very simple question. Is there a model that we can use from an Islamic perspective? My second question is about land redistribution. is there guidance from Qur'an or Hadith about land redistribution, or can we get guidance from Islamic history?
That's an interesting question, and I have been asked the question before. I had actually noted it down for some discussion in some of the other. I still told it, so it's fortuitous that we actually bring it up. Yes, we do have something in that regard. I made reference to the ayah in Surah Hashr, where Allah Ta'ala speaks about property that was gained through conquest. ما أفاء الله على رسوله. That particular property that was gained conquest, which the enemy left and departed on the battlefield, we took hold of that. What happens to that? So there is a very detailed distribution mechanism set up there. It first goes فَلِلَّهِ وَلِرَسُولِهِ وَلِذِي الْقُرْبَى وَالْيَتَامَى وَالْمَسَاكِينِ وَالْمُسْلِمِينَ. Category after categories identified. And it's in this particular respect that, interestingly, the condemnation of monopolization comes in. كَيْ لَا يَكُونَ دُولَةً بَيْنَ الْأَغْنِيَاءِ مِنْكُمْ. That is there where Allah mentions the idea of that there should be no monopolization. Once upon a time, I think wealth was concentrated in lands. In Western Europe, under the feudal system, the more land you had, the richer you were. Like, for example, in tribal society in South Africa, the more cattle you have, probably the richer you will be. But industrialization meant that it took a different direction. You own a big factory, you don't need to own much land. But South Africa very much is still, the agrarian sector of the economy is still a major sector. And I think much of the inequality in our country comes about on account of that. Just as an aside, in Pakistan at this moment, after so many years of having been a Muslim state or republic, whatever you want to call it, it is still the very rich and the oligarchs that own most of the land. So there's still very much that. So anyway, when did Muslims first encounter it? In Nabi Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam's time, there was not much of an issue about land. The first issue came about upon the conquest of Khaybar. What would happen? Muslims they did not own that much land. They needed a little bit of land within which to farm. And that's about it. But then what happened was that they suddenly conquered Khaybar. Khaybar was owned by the Jews who were there before. Now Muslims have taken hold of it. They could have immediately expelled them all. They didn't expel them all. They went into a contractual arrangement with them whereby we own the land, you work the land. And we split the profits of it all. Then what happened, much bigger than that, was what happened in the time of Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, where the whole of Iraq was a very, very fertile country at that time. Southern Iraq especially, the marshlands, very fertile. The Arabs didn't know anything of the kind. When they saw it, they conquered it, they'd taken it over from whoever were the previous masters, and now in terms of the manner in which booty is going to be distributed, distribution of booty is basically a two-way split. 4/5 and 1/5. 1/5 goes into the coffers of state. What happens to the other 4/5? That gets distributed between the fighters. The Mujahideen were part of that. Umar ibn al-Khattab couldn't bring himself to that particular distribution for a very good reason. He saw two problems with that. So first of all, you're going to become big landowners. Big landowners don't go out for the jihad effort any longer. Secondly, you and your descendants will own it. What about all the other Muslims who are still to come? It's going to lead to monopolization within one group. So he spent a few days, read the remaining ayat, consulted with the other Sahaba radiallahu anhum. Then he called the party who was opposed to him. This party was eminent Sahaba, Bilal, the Muaddin of Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, Abdul Rahman ibn Auf, all of these. He called them and he said that they debated the issue. He said, I found a solution in the Qur'an. And that solution is what? That land must be distributed. 1/4 goes into the Baytul Mal. But the other 4/5 should be kept for all future generations, because Allah Ta'ala thereafter makes mention of 3 other parties. He says for the fuqara of the muhajirin. Thereafter for the ansar. And I'm condensing the entire ayah. And then comes the last ayah, وَالَّذِينَ جَاءُوا مِن بَعْدِهِمْ. Those that will still come in future. So Umar said, what will happen to those who will come in future if they don't have a share in the land? If Iraq had become the personal fiefdoms of 12, 15 families who were there at that time, they would be hugely, they would probably outrank the Rothschilds of today, for example. They would own, and imagine what that lands had become in terms of the oil wealth. But it wasn't done. So it was kept in trust for the entire ummah. So we have some kind of precedent. To what extent that precedent will fit into where we are in South Africa right now, any other country, will probably be something that needs to be discussed at a forum where those will participate who actually have the power to bring about change. Bismillah.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh. Firstly, for your presentation. Over time, there have been a number of economic theories that have taken precedence, and some of these have been more in tune with Islam and Islamic economics, and others less so. And one of the theories that are currently being put forward in both academic circles and within civil society is the idea of the gift economy or the sacred economy, which is based on collaborative community and mutual gain rather than personal gain, and value rather than profit. And also has an underlying thread of sacredness and spirituality and selflessness. And so what I want to know is, from the theories that are available now, we know that al-hikmatu diratul mu'mineen, what is most closely resembled to what Islamic economic theory should be. I mean, there really are a number of ideas. Some of them are just ideas that it's hard to find something that closely reflects the gift economy currently. But just in terms of theory, what should we be studying more in depth and trying to take forward as Muslims? Because it would be difficult to think that, and as you mentioned, to think that the current neoliberal economic paradigm is congruent with Islam, because it's really not. So we need macro change rather than things like Islamic finance, which is needed and it helps us on a personal level. But on a macro level, that doesn't really take us forward in terms of achieving an Islamic economic model.
That was actually a type of question that I was dreading. Some person with a background in economics is going to ask me a question that I don't have the answer to. But I think that in your question, the answer is implicit within the question. We cannot be a complete liberal economy as we have seen elsewhere, because we have certain impositions. There is an idea of stewardship. There's an idea of service to society through that. There's the idea of tadamun, what we call it now, social cohesion, social responsibilities, and all of those. They exist in all these embryonic forms. So if we're going to structure any kind of economic theory that ignores all of those aspects and we mimic a complete liberal economy, I think we'd have missed the boat in that one. We cannot go to the other extreme either, because where we go and deny complete private ownership and things like that. So I think the idea that, or rather the phrase that you mentioned, part of the hadith which says al-hikmatu dallatul mu'min, should probably be the guiding light in this particular regard. There are some things which are clearly enunciated, clearly set out. And then there are some things which are somehow or the other not that clearly stated, but we know from the general tendencies within the Sharia that which is more beneficial. That is going to be more beneficial. The kind of theory that we'll call maslaha, public interest, will have to be used, and the consideration of what the broader maqasid and objectives of the Sharia will have to be brought into play in order to create an equilibrium between these various extremes. Exactly how it's going to be done now is what's going to have to be discussed at a level and at a forum by those who are probably much more able than what I am. Who's going to do it? Scholars will start doing it. I think this kind of thing starts emerging from scholars. It will have to be collaborative effort. A collaborative effort between both those who have a very firm grasp and a firm footing within the traditional disciplines, and those who understand economics, where it was, where it is going, where it stands right now today as well. It has to be a collaborative effort of that kind, and in that manner to structure something with a very finely balanced mechanism within it that will be of greatest benefit to society, because khairun nas anfa'um lin nas, best amongst men are those who are most of greatest use to men.
Any other questions?
Just in terms of what the OSCM said, and speaking up from the trend and my thoughts towards the sort of macro context where governments are basically underpinned by their economic policy. In other words, people vote people into power based on what they believe they can get out from that sort of government. And if you bring it sort of back down home in our microcosm and we talk about nationalization, when we go to the ballot box in South Africa, we generally get guidance on the basis of that party stands for equality. That party brought us perhaps from apartheid into the democracy that we have today. But very little is actually said about parties in the economic policy and the economic policy that underpins what they actually stand for. Because as I said, in the macrocosm, governments actually stand by the economic policy. In other words, this is what's going to make us money. Why is it that we see that vacuum is not being filled when we do go to voting, when there is elections, when we're actually not getting sort of guidance in terms of the economic policies that governments, that parties are actually pursuing?
I think it's simply on account of the nature of the beast called politics. especially at electoral times. At election times, more lies get told than any other time of the year. And even if any party gives you their particular economic policy, there's no guaranteeing where things are going to be headed for. And then simply the nature of what it is. Most people, the bulk of voters in society, are people to whom the concepts and the precepts of economics are something so hazy, something so intangible. They wouldn't understand the bulk of what there is to. So even if someone comes along and tells him, some parties might oversimplify things to say we're going to give you land ownership, which eventually they don't live up to. But if you bring it down to that particular level, that person is swayed. He's swayed, but on account of the nature of this particular thing, he never gets what he. Even if we insist upon this particular party coming forward, and I would assume that in circles of academia, when a particular party comes and speaks to university students, when he speaks to intellectuals, he's not going to be speaking simply about putting bread on the table. He's going to be speaking, he's not going to insult his audience by, small little nitty-gritties. He is going to speak some kind of economic policies and things like that, because that's what that audience wants to hear. However, for the next 5 years, to what extent is it going to be enacted, that I think the track record has not been very good in that regard. So I don't know to what extent does it answer your question, but that's what I have to say about it. How far is the time?
15 minutes.
10 minutes, fine.
Any other questions? Bismillah.
I just want to know, from Islamic banking and finance, would you think that Islamic banking would be a good development tool for Africa? Because back in colonialism and also apartheid, we see that Western Europe, in introducing conventional banking systems, actually caused the African economy to deteriorate. So would you think that Islamic banking and finance would offer great solutions or would rather serve as a development tool to enhance and to grow the African economy?
I would believe that it has that potential, but there's another potential side by side with it. The other potential is it can go down exactly the same route as conventional banking has. Because the manner in which it is going to be rolled out to that particular public, it's supposed to be participatory in a certain sense. So the only difference exists at the level of the way the contract is structured. Often the outcomes might be in terms of rands and cents, in terms of percentage and figures, slightly different percentages in terms of the split of profit. But often they just mimic to a great extent what has been done elsewhere, or rather what conventional banking has done. This becomes more worrisome when we consider that the biggest purveyors, or rather intended purveyors of Islamic banking to the rest of Africa, happens to be the same players in the conventional space, where a window is created within the conventional space. And I think that conventional banking has probably seen writing on the wall, this kind of thing cannot go on forever, but they want to remain in business. So it's a matter of the whole world there's a new rush for, what did they call it once upon a time, the rush for Africa, that they had once upon a time. There's a new rush for Africa on. And the new rush for Africa is, and it's this terrible term, the unbanked masses of Africa. What do they want from the unbanked masses of Africa? To put their funds with them. So it can go very, very wrong. It depends upon the extent to which it is going to be negotiated by the various parties. Who are the various parties in this regard? The banks themselves, those particular scholars and economists who happen to be advising them. There is a fine balance. Islamic banking at this moment in time is a matter of fitting a square into a circle. Our square, the square of Islamic finance, it exists within another paradigm. It exists within a paradigm of, the ancient Islamic world and the way it was structured. And then we find ourselves in a post-industrial world where that was created by the interest mechanism and an interest-based capitalist economy. So we are trying to fit the one into the other. We have no choice but to do it. But the idea in the minds of the participants is that slowly, eventually change will come. How rapidly will that slowly come about? If it doesn't happen rapidly enough, by the time that the unbanked masses of Africa become banked, then they will be as enslaved as they were once upon a time. But if meaningful change can come about quicker, because we need to balance the one off against the other, if that kind of balancing act and shifting the fulcrum of balance from one side to the other, if it happens quicker, then we have a more participatory kind of system. So much is still in the balance, in the scale. The predictions, I'm 50-50 on it right now. We need to see what the future is going to hold.
Any other questions?
Just to trust is driving sort of its status. Moulana said China is driving a wedge between Muslim nations and their religion.
They own Muslim public.
Oh,
Their own Muslim public, not the rest of us outside here, but their own Muslim public. For example, last year Ramadan, news came out that in China, if you're 15, 16 years old, you cannot fast. And Muslims are being asked to spy upon one another, see who's fasting. You can fast if you're a legal adult over there, then you do your own thing. But if you're a teenager, no, you cannot fast. I mean, that's a liberty that we and our children, everyone else have. But they have policies of that nature, which that's what I refer to when they say they're driving a wedge between their own Muslim public and their religion.
Perhaps I'll end off with the final question. Moulana Ibn Khaldun, in his Muqaddimah, he talks about the concept of asabiya in the cyclical order of a civilization, and he says as you have economic growth, rapid economic growth, you find that luxury creeps in and opulence, and as a result of this opulence you have this moral degradation or moral decadence. And on the other extreme, you have Adam Smith, and we always seem to be chastising him for capitalism or for his wealth of nations, but he even saw the need or the importance of social cohesion and morality when he spoke about it in his moral sentiments, and surely he never predicted the rise of industrialization. So how do we, because we in a sort of capitalist environment, how do we bring back this asabiya, being that we're not in a traditional or feudal sort of economy or political system in our homes and our societies and so on?
I think as far as our homes, our societies, at the level of individuals and our spheres of influence is concerned, there we have much leeway. We can actually bring about those particular changes by instilling values, which is part of إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ, what Dawud alayhi salam spoke about, bringing those aspects back. I think aspects of that nature, that kind of moral and ethical approach to finance by its very nature leads man to be inclines man to be immoral, because he wants to make as large a profit of the next party as possible. So there must be some restraining factor. And as far as Muslims are concerned, it is iman, it is faith that will do that. Other societies might look at a different concept of what morals would be. But as far as we as individuals are concerned, within our spheres of influence, it will just have to be part of the educational, the tarbiyah aspects that we instill into ourselves, into our children, into our students, and our spheres of influence. Beyond that, when it comes to society at large and the structures that govern society and make rules for society completely, that's where the da'wah element will have to play a certain role. We have to present what Islam stands for. In which manner? In the form of seminars, in the form of research, in the form of these various things, in the form of Muslims, academics, high-powered, well-educated ones, looking into these aspects and presenting it to the world as here is an alternative that we have. Muslims alone are not doing this. As I mentioned, people such as Jeffrey Sachs is also saying there needs to be a moral foundation upon which commerce will happen and upon which an economy can be structured. We have something in that regard. We have a very, very clear moral foundation that we do not easily compromise upon. So, first of all, live it ourselves. Secondly, present it unto others. And in that way, inshallah, we could perhaps do something useful.
Inshallah. We have one more question from Anwar.
You commented that Islamic finance currently, the Moulana system, basically can be used as a social development tool if it goes the right way. Right? But it's still a very adaptive system given the economic system of work. While the Qur'an lays out economic principles but not an economic framework, and Islamic history has had a framework, but that framework might not be applicable today given the status quo of the world, right? Moving from an adaptive response rather to a transformative response that will basically allow us to a transformative model, basically to chart the progress of the world, a more just system, inshallah. What can we extrapolate from the current economic system that will enable us to do that and might be still useful to us for an ideal based on the Quranic principles, considering we don't have a framework?
Yeah, I think in this regard what comes to my mind immediately is CSI, corporate social responsibility. There was a time when corporate entities were completely unbridled in what they do. Do what you want, make as much of a profit as possible, and be the psychopath that you wish. And eventually governments woke up to the idea that corporate entities that are doing business in society must be held responsible, must give something back to society. At the moment it's being imposed by law. It's being imposed by law that you must do this amount of, maybe a certain amount of your profits or something must be given back to society. That's imposed by law upon certain types of entities. In a very similar manner, I think that's the type of thing that could simply be mimicked and taken elsewhere. And a very good manner of doing it is by reviving certain things which we had in our classical history. The institution of waqf has died as far as Muslims are concerned, except in as much as concerns the masjid. The only waqf that we know up to today is the masjid. But waqf played a much greater, much more meaningful role in society once upon a time. It was probably one of the pillars of social society. Waqf was what ran our universities. George Maqdisi is a scholar that has traced back the mechanism of universities and how they fund themselves to the madrasa of medieval Islam, and how the madrasa based upon a waqf. And then we find universities and their endowments and all of these things. They existed. So the idea of a waqf, what's the word now? Taking various different forms, not just the masjid alone, but charitable awqaf, educational awqaf, and I feel, yes, there is something in South Africa, and I think he's one of the sponsors here as well. I saw Awqaf SA happens to be, and Awqaf happens to be a sponsor here, but Awqaf SA has this very exciting idea of let's revive the system of waqf, and that's where Muslims voluntarily step forward and say this is what we give back to society. So corporate social responsibilities and investment of that nature is something that we can take from there, but then we do have certain aspects and mechanisms within ourselves that could be brought to bear in a meaningful, useful and responsible manner.
Jazakallah, Moulana Tauha Karaan.